You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 306 for February 2025. I am your host, Heather McDaniel-McDevitt. On today's show, we are going to talk about the recent executive orders and the potential impact on CRM. But before we do that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the show, starting with Andrew in Southern California.
Hey guys, how's it going?
And Doug in Scotland.
Hey everyone.
Sounds so excited, Doug. And Spencer, our guest today, is the author of the Substack newsletter called Social Stigma. And he writes some really great articles, I believe to be very balanced and provide a lot of background information. It takes a decent amount of research to put these together, I am sure. So I'm going to welcome Spencer. Welcome, Spencer, to the CRM podcast.
Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate y'all reaching out to me about this.
So for those that are listening, we'll be putting in a couple links for you to read his articles. The way the Substack works is, he puts his content out for free. He does have some kind of member-only content, but they're really good stuff. Not that the member-only is not good stuff. I'm sure it is too. I haven't gotten to that point yet because I'm a new subscriber. But what he provides, it's just really, if you want to know the ins and outs of some of these very controversial subjects, if he writes on it, I personally think it's just really well done. So it gives you a really well-rounded understanding of some of these topics that people like to, start with the sky is falling, we're all screwed mentality, rather than really looking at the nitty-gritty of it. And really, if we as archaeologists want to, number one, move forward in our career, number two, if we want to make a difference and we want to help others move forward in their career, or we just want to make a difference in preservation, facts are important. And so I think that these articles that I've read from Spencer really do that well. So we asked him if he would join us so that we could really do an in-depth discussion on the executive orders that have just been laid out in the last couple weeks and how, in short, that will affect CRM. So I'd like to start off with Spencer. If you could just give us a little bit of a background, of you as an archaeologist.
Thanks a lot, Heather. I appreciate the kind words about the newsletter. I do probably spend more time than I should on it, honestly, but it's been a fun thing to write about the last couple of years. I'm originally from East Tennessee, Smoky Mountains. I got my start in archaeology working for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I've spent some time working for the federal agencies, the Bureau of Land Management in California. I've spent some time working in academia. I've spent some time working in the private sector in CRM and also as a project manager more generally for energy projects in Wyoming. Now I'm the Wyoming state archaeologist based out of Laramie, Wyoming. Our offices are based out of the anthropology department here. So I kind of split my time between doing some academic research about sites in Wyoming in the high plains and some stuff about the peopling of the Americas. We manage a repository here where we store all the artifacts, but also spend quite a bit of time engaged in state level politics and and more generally in federal politics, following policy and regulations and doing what we can do through the political system to do the best we can for historic preservation, historic resources.
Great. Before we really dive into this subject matter, I'm really interested to hear just a little rundown of how you got into writing on these subjects.
It was really just a couple of years ago, I found myself just complaining too much to my friends and colleagues about stuff.
Archaeologists complain?
A lot of like conversations out in the field around campfires or, at the bar at the happy hour. And I just thought that's really not a very productive use of your time unless you put it to good use. So Substack around that time was kind of coming into prominence, and I'd started following a couple writers on it. And I just thought it was a good platform to get some of these thoughts down in perpetuity so that they're not just, floating off into the ether of a bar or a campfire. They're actually documented somewhere and in a format where people from all over can weigh in and give their opinions and maybe provoke some thoughts, that kind of thing. Overall, it's been really good. I like getting these ideas out there, but also just like sitting down and actually sorting them out in my own head. So the best way to do that, I've found, is just writing about it and, diving into the nitty gritty of these issues and trying to synthesize your own thoughts about it and get them on, type them out in this format and get them out there. So in general, it's been both. I'm glad to hear that other people are benefiting from it. I've got 250 subscribers now, but also it's been really beneficial for me too. And honestly, I'd recommend anybody that thinks deeply about this stuff to do the same thing. It's just a really good way to grapple with your own thoughts on some of these complicated issues.
Excellent. Another aspect of your articles that I appreciate is that you have links. And so, just like what Spencer is saying, if it is something, I think if we're, some people just want to be an archaeologist and they're not interested in these things, and that's fine. But if you're going to complain and you're going to start feeling concerned, it just having the information, knowing the facts will definitely put you in a better position to act responsibly and may even make you feel a little bit better. That's maybe not as bad as you might think it is. So what's nice is, just like Spencer was saying, is, not only reading and being inspired by people like Spencer, or hopefully maybe sometimes the CRM podcast, that you go and do, that we all go and pursue our own path of understanding by really looking and not just taking people's word for it. So I do appreciate you having links in your articles, allows people to do the same thing. Plus, it's a very transparent way of writing. We're going to focus on 7, which is what your article focuses on, 7 of the executive orders, or at least the areas that might impact CRM. And there's others potentially, but these are the biggies. So I'm going to list them off and then we'll just start going through them one by one. First one is unleashing American energy. Second is the wind farms. And we'll give you the actual titles, or somewhat abbreviated titles: promoting civic architecture, federal workforce accountability, regulatory freeze pending review, return to in-person work, and indigenous knowledge and historic preservation. So let's start off with unleashing American energy. And I thought I would just really quickly read, just to give us and then we'll move forward. Section 3 of this Unleashing American Energy, and this is in Spencer's article. Immediate review of all agency actions that potentially burden the development of domestic energy resources. The heads of all agencies shall review all existing regulations, orders, guidance, documents, policies, settlements, consent orders, and any other agency actions, collectively agency actions, to identify those agency actions that impose an undue burden on the identification, development, or use of domestic energy resources, with particular attention to oil, natural gas, coal, hydropower, biofuels, critical mineral, and nuclear energy resources, or that are otherwise inconsistent with the policy set forth in Section 2. You can go look that up, as this order, including restrictions on consumer choice of vehicles and appliances. And basically, this Section B, subsection B, just says that within 30 days of the date of this order, the head of each agency shall, in consultation with the Director of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, and the National Economic Council, develop and begin implementing actions to suspend, revise, or rescind all agency actions identified as unduly burdensome under the subsection A. There's more, but we'll leave it at that. So, Spencer, I don't know if you want to kind of weigh in about that, and I think then we'll all weigh in.
Yeah, I saw this one as potentially the most impactful on the American CRM sector, basically because American CRM is solely dependent on the regulations that this executive order is talking about. Anybody that listens to this knows Section 106 is kind of what we call the American CRM industry. And what that refers to is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is extremely short. If you go back and read it, it's like 2 or 3 sentences. Basically just says that agencies have to consider the impacts on historic properties before any federal undertaking. But out of that very short section in the National Historic Preservation Act, we've developed this enormous regulatory apparatus based on the federal codes of regulation. And then from that set of codes, there's been all these subsidiary documents, all the bulletins and guidance documents that a lot of people in CRM are familiar with. So in my mind, and I wrote about this in an earlier article having to do with the overturning of the Chevron deference. We don't have to get into that in too much detail here, but basically it puts CRM in a really tenuous position. The NHPA is a congressional act. It's robust. It's really hard to repeal congressional acts, but the regulations that implement those congressional acts are in a really fragile kind of position, and they can be changed, they can be rescinded. And especially after this Chevron deference decision by the United States Supreme Court, makes it really easy to do that. So I saw this executive order as potentially the most impactful and potentially the most deleterious to American CRM. And since I wrote this, actually, the new Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, put out a secretary order specifically calling out Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act for review. So it came to fruition kind of the way I thought it might, where this is certainly on the radar of the Secretary of the Interior, along with a lot of other environmental regulations involving NEPA and the Clean Air Act and Migratory Birds Treaty Act and all these other sort of environmental preservation-oriented regulations that the Interior uses to implement their projects.
Great. Thanks, Spencer. Great overview.
Yeah, I would just add some more background to, we're going to be talking executive orders and stuff like that. But an executive order is a type of executive directive, and it actually means very little in the sense that, like, if Trump was to say, I'd like fries with that, that is also an executive directive. It's just coming from the president. There's some legal things about what has to go into a registry of regulations, and so this comes into that. They somewhat get overblown in media. A lot of executive orders are essentially a good PR, so it's always good to keep that in mind. And that's sort of, when you're reading some of these, it's to realize actually some of it's just bullshit. But the bad side of that is this can happen without an executive order. So a lot of executive orders are actually passed up from agencies that then the president puts out in a PR sort of stunt, as it were. So just this review could have been initiated by the Secretary of Interior if he wanted to on his own, and can be done at any time in the future by any other sort of Secretary of Interior, or even potentially lower down on the food chain, as it were, as well. So it's worth pointing out that, like, this sort of review is not going to go away with like a rescinding of a executive order. It could pop up in different ways. And essentially, the review that's going to happen, there's a couple of laws around this. Basically, it has to go through a process. And so when you initiate these reviews, basically you have to put it out for public comment. You have to post it in certain places to say it's going to be a review. But sort of the unfortunate part about any reviews is, as long as they follow the process, they don't really actually have to listen to public consultation. So at any point, this could be happening at any time in the future. So even if, for example, I think Secretary of Interior had said that they're going to review it, and so it's probably going to happen now or next couple of months, fairly soon. But we're not kind of out of the woods in that even if this review comes out fairly okay, we could easily have another one in 6 months or a year or 18 months. It's not something that's going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I agree. I think The other, just have a couple things to add to that. First of all, public review for any kind of document like this, whether it's CEQA in California, CEQA in New York, or any of the others, including federal, public review, that's a normal thing that, the public weighs in, and it could just be taken with a grain of salt. But the one check, because the government's full of checks and balances, the one check with that is that then these groups can sue. And sometimes that suing is effective. So it isn't just that the public review is out there, it comes in and people can just ignore, which I think a lot of people are just assuming that's what's going to occur. But, when there are issues brought up, and if those issues are considerable and they have some kind of merit, there could be a lawsuit that is won later on down the road. So it isn't just a
yes and no. So
okay.
I'll wait for you to finish, Heather, but I'll come back. It's as anything, it's a bit more complicated and fun.
Of course it is, but we can't delve into that complicated. We can't get that deep into it because we have 7 to review here. But definitely, and we can maybe cover this on another podcast because I really do want to pick Spencer's brain for all of these, just in an overview. And the other thing with the executive orders is that, these are triggering actions. It's a strategy by the Trump administration to trigger actions in a public forum. So that's why it's being done in this way. That's why he's signing executive orders and having press conferences in his Oval Office, is because he wants people to know what's going on. And you could argue he only wants people to know certain things that are going on, but he is being transparent in at least these executive orders, and it's triggering action in a way. Now, you're right, it could occur anyway, but I think it is, if nothing else, it's letting his base know that he is following up on what he said he was going to do. And most people are agreeing to that. Andrew, do you want to weigh in before we go to the next segment?
The short answer is not really. I do want to just hear what Spencer has to say, because I think this is so vital. I think even just covering this first bit is so good, for people to hear. So I'll hold my usual pithy comments until the end.
Fair enough. Okay, we'll be right back with section 2. Welcome back to CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 306. And we're talking about the new executive orders and their potential impact on CRM. We have Spencer Pelton here from Social Stigma, and we were just talking about the Unleashing American Energy executive order and the potential impact on CRM. During our break, Spencer brought up a good point that we'd like to at least jump on, talk about it real quick before we go on to the additional executive orders. I also would like to get your take on unduly burdened some. That, I think, unduly is an important word, action word here. So, but first, why don't you go ahead with what you were bringing up during our break?
I think the important thing to take home from this is just a lot of people in the private sector of archaeology, I feel like for a long time have had more confidence in the sort of the regulatory structure that underpins the industry than they really should have. All this stuff is really coming out of regulations, not acts of Congress. And I feel like a lot of folks have, and me included, for a long time until I kind of got in the weeds of this stuff, we just kind of taken it for granted. This has always existed. This will always exist. But it's not necessarily true. And I just really would like to impart that we should be spending a lot more time thinking about how to enshrine some of these kind of basic practices that have become normative in CRM over the last several decades into actual laws passed through Congress, as opposed to the regulations that mandate this practice and dictate how we do it.
I totally agree. I think that it would also provide consistency across the board. I mean, I think a lot of what has been the impetus or the argument on the other side of this is that, sometimes you can have a very reasonable approach to our investigations, our studies and process. And sometimes people go they do go, I think it becomes burdensome, and sometimes it doesn't become logical in the way that it's done. And a lot of times, when you don't have the strength of having it actually be codified, the law, there's a lot of interpretation involved. And I think that it would actually do a favor to those that are on the federal side, state archaeologists, to actually have, ways that are a lot more codified, so that the interpretation and the pressure to interpret from various different sides in one direction or another is not as wide open as it is right now. And I think our discipline could definitely benefit from some more consistency in methodology.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those great debates of it's a mixed bag. Because in a way, once you've put it down to law, it's a lot harder to change. And then you end up with those sort of fun, silly laws that we always, everyone always puts up on comedy shows or something like that. Like it's illegal to run through a town on a Sunday yelling "clear the horses" or some really weird, we've all seen those odd laws and stuff like that. I think it becomes...
Chicken feathers in California can't drive, and chicken feathers can't fly out of your truck. That's actually a law. Yeah.
Again, really, really, you get that sort of level, and then it makes it hard to change for the world's always changing, and so there's sometimes you codify a very specific thing, and there'll be laws about the craziest thing I could think about is in the UK. It's to start a company or to shut down a company, you literally have to post a notice in a paper gazette put out, because that was a law a really long time ago. A gazette that pretty much no one reads because it's paper and we have the internet these days. So there's things like that. So it's a double-edged sword. I think our issue is that we've got used to it. And now there's a sort of regime change, as it were, that is incredibly hostile to what we currently do and how we currently do things. And now it's looking like a less of a good choice that we didn't go in there and get a lot more detail in the laws. But I just throw it out there. It is, I'm not sure if there's a perfect medium where you can have just the right amount of regulations and the right amount of everything written into the law. I think it's a bit of a trial and error, but I'd go with Spencer. What he said is, we've probably gotten way too complacent in the last couple, not even the last couple of years, last couple of decades, and probably should have been thinking a lot more about once we had these regulations, how we could codify some of them.
Spencer, you had your...
Yeah, I'll just real quick present the other side of the double-edged sword, which is, as cumbersome and convoluted as the legislative process is, it does produce robust consensus building on really the largest scale. And the danger in kind of relying upon regulations that are adaptable, which can be good, but that are also extremely malleable to the politics du jour, is that you end up drifting away from the original purpose of that consensus building exercise of passing an act of Congress. And really the regulations become so divorced from the original intent at points that you really have to step back and wonder if there's any consensus behind those regulations at all anymore. It becomes super divorced from the kind of the purely democratic process of getting a bill drafted and through two houses of Congress. And you're right. It's a double-edged sword. It's less adaptable, but it's also more democratic, I guess, in my mind.
Very true. Good point. Great point. We can't give up on trying to make things better because other people have things are out of date or there's been some ridiculous laws put on the books. We need to do better. We need to learn from that and do better. And I do like Spencer's point that it is a democratic process. It doesn't just happen. These are laws that and that's where people need to engage themselves and really be part of that discussion to make sure that these next steps, codifying a little bit better our discipline and how we do it is, it's important. And right now, I'll tell you, from somebody who works in many different states, it is all over the place. And there are some states that are very reasonable, and some even, it can be even all over the place within a state in how people interpret. Some states have some really great methodology that's already, laid out, and when you're walking in exactly how what they're going to expect from you, and others don't have anything. And some are really insanely, unduly burdensome. And I do think that for somebody who works primarily in California, but all over the country, I run into this a lot. And those of us that are in CRM that have been working, especially if you're more in the managerial position, you come across this all the time. And yes, we are here to preserve, heritage and cultural resources, but we also need to do it in a reasonable way. And I think we have created a lot of enemies in our discipline because sometimes we are not reasonable. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that just because I don't want to go down too far down the road. But all right, so let's move on to the wind farms. You had seemed like in your article, you're a little kind of up in the air about trying to figure out, why this executive order came about. You want to share that?
Yeah, this executive order, I just thought it was funny. It has such a cumbersome name. Temporary withdrawal of all areas on the outer continental shelf from offshore wind leasing and review of the federal government's leasing and permitting practices for wind projects.
It rolls off the tongue.
There is no Make America Great Again, but it does describe the intent of the order really well. I was concerned about this one because I'd say the vast majority of the big energy projects in our state in Wyoming, it's a very windy place. They are attached to wind farms. And so, for instance, my first CRM job in Wyoming back in 2013 was surveying in advance of a wind farm that still has not been built. Say that. But and a lot of my friends, they basically become kind of the bread and butter of the CRM sector in Wyoming. And I suspect that's going to dry up pretty quick. I mean, the wind companies are still going to try to do some preparatory work for a time when these wind leasing activities are started again. But I would suspect that they would just think it's too much of a risk to devote capital to doing that work at this point. And it might be a tough field season for a lot of CRM companies in Wyoming and a lot of other windy places in the lower 48 as well.
Well, I'll say, just from somebody who's worked on a few wind farm projects, and some that have taken probably, just a crazy amount of years because of some of the unduly burdensome manners of doing things in the federal government. But, the wind companies have seen this coming. So these companies have been shifting gears in preparation for whether it was the Harris administration or the Trump administration that entered the White House next. So I do think, there may be an impact here, or there will be a impact here, but these companies are good at shifting gears real fast. And they have been preparing for this, at least the ones that are good at what they do, as far as making money, that is, have been preparing for this shift in the energy sector. So I saw it, I've seen it for at least the last year and a half, 2 years, because some of the writing was on the wall. So I don't think it's going to be the end of work. There may be a lull, but I don't think that there's going to be, especially with how quickly things are moving right now with the Trump administration. I think maybe people are not going to be working on wind farm projects, but they'll be working on other kind of energy projects.
Yeah, and I should add too, some of the shift that we've seen in this state towards building wind projects solely on private lands might have been a shift that was inspired by the anticipation of something like this. If there's no federal nexus, you could build a wind farm wherever you want. Basically, you just need approval from like the industrial siting commissions of your state and any state laws, right? So there is that possibility, right? Federal wind leases are not the only wind projects that are built.
Such an excellent point. And that is something I wanted to bring up earlier. So I'm glad you reminded me. This is something that people have to, and I don't think everyone understands, especially for those that are doing the really hard work in the field. They may not understand, this line in the sand between federal triggered projects and projects that happen on private land. So federally triggered, and for those that already know this, forgive me, but I think it's important that we do say this for those that don't understand. Federally triggered permit projects, or those that are on federal land, those that are funded by federal monies, and those that have some sort of permitting trigger, some other kind of trigger. So even though it's on private land, if let's say it impacts U.S. waters, or you have those kinds of permits, then it would still have a federal trigger. But Spencer is exactly right. This does not mean that wind farms are going away. There has been a shift, with these companies to figure out other ways of making it happen. So I think we'll go on to the next one, federal workforce accountability. So Spencer, you want to outline that real quick?
Yeah, well, I pulled out several of these executive orders that just kind of have direct impacts on the federal workforce. The first one that we're talking about here is basically about policy influencing positions. I think this is the one you're talking about. It's restoring accountability to policy influencing positions within the federal workforce. So basically, this is an extension of an executive order actually from kind of the final days of the first Trump administration. It establishes a new federal job schedule specific to positions, I'm quoting here, positions of confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating character, not normally subject to change as a result of a presidential transition. So I probably have the most tenuous grasp on this of any of these, but my understanding is that, there's a lot of positions in the federal government that a lot of them are in DC, and really their primary job is to do policy research and write federal regulations or write federal guidance documents and kind of trickle those down to the lower levels of their respective agencies. This is how you get the codes of federal regulations that implement Section 106 or the CFRs that implement NAGPRA, for instance. And the same way with basically any other federal law. And this might make for some robust conversation. It already has actually on my blog, but I'm generally supportive of this action. These federal policymakers, this is not kind of like your local field office archaeologist. These are very powerful positions whose decisions really impact thousands and thousands of people. And they don't have really any accountability to be, just like any other federal worker, they don't have accountability to be fired or to be promoted, on the other hand. And I really feel like they should have, that the executive branch should have a little more say in who these people are that are writing policies for these agencies. Again, there's some drawbacks to that. You don't want a revolving door of policymakers, really. But if a policymaker is really handing down some pretty onerous regulations or some regulations that are really out of touch with the goals of the administration or of the agency as a whole, then there should be some lever to pull to remove that person from that position. And right now there isn't. So this executive order basically addresses that issue.
Right. And just a reminder, when you have an administration that, in this case, the Trump administration that has entered the White House, it was done in democratic process through voting. And so, to have people in positions making decisions, it is reasonable for those decisions to be in line with the current administration that is in the White House that was voted by the American people to be there. So, this is not uncommon, and what is good for the goose is good for the gander. So this would move forward to the next administration, whoever that is. So, I think as a whole, looking at these executive orders, but looking at what happens as a result of them, it's important to understand that this is moving forward going to not just be for this administration, but for future administrations. Okay, we're going to go to our next segment 3. We'll be right back. Welcome back to CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 306. We're talking about the executive orders from the Trump administration that have recently happened in the last 2 weeks and their potential impact on CRM archaeology. This is our last segment and we've got a lot to cover. So Doug, you had something that you were going to say in the last segment. So why don't we start off with that and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, it was about the sort of press release circus nature of executive orders. It's just also for everyone, and this goes for any administration because it this one's particularly bad, but there'll be other executive orders that maybe you like from a different administration. Just because it's been put out as an executive order does not make it legal. So that last one probably violates the law. It's going to court, so it's already been sued. My other comment on that sort of thing is, I may have said this story before on the podcast, but there's a great sort of story from the business world about Sony. It was 1980s, 1990s, and they were putting out a new boombox. And so they did a wonderful little, got a few people in the room, and they put out like just a plain black one, and they put out, obviously 90s, late 80s. So they had this one that was like neon green and neon yellow and neon orange and all this crazy colors and all that stuff. And they asked, which one do you guys like the best? Everyone's like, oh, of course, the really colorful one, that's the amazing one. And they're like, okay. They thanked everyone for their time. And they said, okay, well, as a reward for participating in this sort of focus group, you can pick one of those boomboxes to take with you. And pretty much everyone took the black one, exactly against what they said that they liked. And the moral of that story is basically look at behavior, don't necessarily look at what people say. Because, people lie, and also people lie to themselves. And you have to be really careful with this executive order as well. A lot of laws, you'll always see the law like Make America Great Again, or the law to prevent child abuse or something like that. They always name them some really great name or really crappy ones. So you get some crap ones in there, but they try to now like name things really great names so that they can then, play politics and be like, oh, they voted against the Keep Kids Safe law and all that sort of stuff. So they'll put in a lot of, fancy wording, but it's really looking at what the intent of that sort of executive order was. And so you can look at, this is a rehash of the one he did I think he put it out in either October or November of, his last term. And basically a lot didn't happen with it. So a bunch of agencies just came back and flat out said, oh yeah, we have no one, we might have 10,000 people, 50,000 people in our agency, but actually no one qualifies for Schedule F. And then they also had some agencies who basically came back and were like, oh, yeah, there's only 600 people in this agency. I think it was the budget office or something like that. 400 and some of them qualify. But some of those people were executive assistants, people who clearly had nothing to do with policy at all. And I think on paper, it sounds like a good idea. And definitely I can totally understand, I think those are good points about being accountable and stuff like that. But in practice, this is really meant so that they can reclassify people who disagree with them and then fire them. Now, whether they can legally do that, it's going to have to go through the courts because it probably violates a couple of laws. But yeah, it's basically like, while this executive order sounds good on paper, it's actually really shit.
So I think we need to get on to the next executive order, but I will say one thing here. Listen, this is politics. It happens in every single administration. And I think that we are doing ourselves a disservice as archaeologists who want to be archaeologists, right? That when we start going down the road of, we're all screwed, right? Based on what we assume, whatever administration is in the office, that we assume that they're thinking this and they want to destroy us and they want that.
No. This is not based on assumptions, though. This is based on what they did the last time. And this is what I'm saying is like you got to be able to call a ball, a strike, a strike. And while this one it looks good,
On all counts.
it's a strike, man.
On all counts. On all counts. So we're not going to go down that road. We're going to move on to the next order. Regulatory freeze pending review. Spencer, do you mind giving us a...
This one's pretty simple. I mean, the federal government produces a lot of regulations. There's like hundreds of thousands of pages of them. They're coming out every day in the Federal Register every week. This basically just says we're not doing that anymore unless those regulations are reviewed by the head of their respective agencies. What I wrote in this is that I kind of assume that already happened. So like, for instance, when there's new federal regulations that come out pertaining to Section 106 or whatever, I kind of assume that like the final signature was the Secretary of the Interior. But I guess that wasn't true. I generally, again, think this is a good call. This is the same thing I was talking about earlier. If you get too many people too far down the ladder writing regulations and putting them out, you run the danger of drifting away from the core missions of the agencies. So I feel pretty strongly that the regulations should be drifted up to the top of the respective agencies. That being said, I mean, some regulations are good, right? And they protect good things. And so freezing these things, could potentially have some harmful impacts. But I think it's probably a good thing to step back and actually reevaluate this process and make sure that everyone within at least agencies are within alignment on directions that are coming down from them.
Yeah. So, you have anytime you have, and this, Trump administration is going at this from a business perspective. When you have a new entity that takes over a business, they typically will audit that business. They will try to figure out, okay, where are there inefficiencies? Where are there areas that are not consistent with the current administration, the current leaders, or a thought process and their missions, just like Spencer said. So this is meant to be an audit. And I absolutely agree with you. Like, the further down you go, the less perspective that somebody has. So when you have been in this business, and anybody in this business knows that when you get to a certain position of managerial, a managerial position, you sit back and you're like, oh my gosh, if I had known this when I was starting out as a tech, there's things I wouldn't have done and things I wouldn't have said. I would have done things differently. So the better perspective, the grander perspective that you have that can only really be gained with experience, practical experience, is, it's important to decision making. And so when you have people that are making these policies and there's no check or balance with those policies and they're just being enacted, that's a problem. It is a problem just from a consistency perspective. So I think that this is I think it's a good thing. I think it'll benefit anybody, any administration that is following. So, Spencer.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick. I mean, a lot of policies in our sector, they're written from these very siloed sort of perspectives in my mind, right? So like, just because it's good for the circumstances with which you're most familiar doesn't mean it's good for the entire United States. And filtering those decisions up to the very top to somebody that has that kind of a nationwide perspective, I think is just good practice. And from my own experience in my small managerial role, I've even, when I've dug into the weeds of some of our staff's decisions kind of down in curation or whatever, and I figured out that they were like, labeling an artifact the wrong way for the last 6 months or whatever. And they just made a decision and went with it and never made it to me. It had this kind of global significance and, global in the context of my office. So I don't know. I feel pretty strongly that those secretaries, the cabinet secretaries, are there for a reason, and it's to make these big decisions that impact a lot of people's lives.
And you can have what they call malicious compliance. You can have people that, go off in a really crazy direction because they have an agenda that is not a part of what they're tasked to do in their job. And that's not good for any administration. It's not good for this country either. So, and it's not good for our discipline. So I think that having some kind of Like you have that in companies. People don't, no good company is going to have people writing reports and then just sending it off to the client, no matter what level the archaeologist is, sending it off to the client without some kind of review. It's got to happen.
Yeah. So this is another sort of, you got to do a little digging. It's in a way a non-issue, but kind of is an issue, as in normally it does go up to a high level anyways to be signed off. Whether they actually read it or not, your guess is as good as mine. It's more of a technicality in that, in a way, it sort of freezes anything coming out for the moment until basically it's a way of quickly just freezing a bunch of stuff until they have a chance to review it. Otherwise, it basically puts on hold. It would normally go up to the top anyways. Right now, there's not a lot of tops, or there's interim people appointed while they wait for approval from Congress. So basically, this is sort of a minor rule that basically just says you have to wait until those interim people sign it off. It's basically a way of pausing all the previous regulations that would have gone out under Biden in the next couple of months. So it's kind of a non-starter. It's a very highly technical executive order that's kind of just a bit meh, but it is a way to just making sure that none of the Biden regulations that would have gone through in the next couple of weeks or months can go through until they decide if they want them to or not.
Okay. And that maybe that is the case, but that actually, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but that happens with every administration. And when you have some of these edicts or policies that go through at the end, sometimes that's not a good thing either, because when you have an administration that decides to put policies, enact policies right at the very end of their administration, and to just slip them in really quick and then leave, that's also not a real effective way of leadership either. So, putting that kind of check in any administration probably should do that. Andrew, did you have something?
No, I want to get to the next thing. I am like a cruel director at this point. I'm getting to the next CEO. Do it.
Return to in-person work.
Exactly. There, return to in-person work. Yes, Spencer.
I'll talk about both of these. These are I don't like both of these. Basically, there's a hiring freeze and also just a blanket return to in-person work. I just feel like this is a very outdated way to do. We have a federal workforce for a reason. I can vouch from personal experience that they're not just sitting on their asses like eating chips on their couch all day. They actually work really hard. So if you have a hiring freeze and you're basically just letting the federal workforce diminish through attrition, like through retirements and people moving on, I'm not fundamentally opposed to that. But first, you need to get rid of some of the workload, and I feel like they're putting the cart before the horse a little bit here. I'm not fundamentally opposed to having a smaller federal workforce, but they're there for a reason. They're doing a job. They're not sitting on their asses all day. They just need to have less of a job through deregulation if they're going to do this. I don't have really a stance on that either way, but I just feel like it's a bad move. You're just going to stress out the remaining federal workforce more because they're going to be tasked with doing more stuff. And then the return to in-person work. I get the sentiment, but this is just a completely political gesture in my mind. I do think I've had personal experience with some federal employees in recent years that have really abused it. And, they're doing archaeology for a different state than they live in. They're managing archaeology remotely from a Zoom screen. And I just don't really feel like that's an effective way to do it. On the other hand, I just don't feel like it's that big of a deal. And honestly, like, GSA outsourcing their office space to people's houses, if they want to do that, is a much more efficient way to house the federal workforce. I kind of feel like it's going to end up being a cost increase because you're going to have to get more office space if everyone needs an office. There's a ton of remote federal employees now, and it's not just COVID that did it. It started way before that. And so I just feel like they took a hatchet to this when they should have taken a scalpel. Some people certainly need to be in the office. A lot of people do not.
I actually think it's a culling strategy in some ways, because there are people that are so married to the in-person or so married to remote work. and just like you said, that are in a totally different state, but working on, it, and it's going to automatically call that workforce because people are not going to they're not going to move back to that state that they're working in, right? So I think that was part of the strategy. The other thing is reactive. It's a statement. It's a statement, and we know that there's, both President Trump and Elon Musk are not for remote work. I do personally, we've talked about remote work. Andrew and I are actually, we like remote work. I definitely think that there's a lot to be said for people being a lot more productive in some positions when they're working in person. Also, the collaboration between people is better. It just is better. I mean, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and remote work, I tell you, it's less productive more than it is productive. But I don't think, and you tell me, Spencer, what you think. I really don't think that this is going to impact the archaeology side as much because we're in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll impact it too much. I do know a lot of federal archaeologists that work remote. It's not the majority of them by any means. But yeah, I mean, archaeology is a tactile discipline. We kind of have to deal with stuff. And I don't think many of us were working remote anyway, really, in the federal workforce, at least.
And I do agree with you. I honestly do not know one archaeologist. And now, in the last year, I've been working with many different state archaeologists, and I don't know one that isn't burdened with a tremendous workload and are not working very hard. So I agree with you. Let's see. Andrew, do you have some? I thought I saw your hand for a second.
No, I'm still just directing from the background, being like, "Are we? Did we make it through, or is there one more?"
I think we made it through. We were going to two
or the pretty buildings one.
Yes, we did. Yeah. We did. We were going to kind of touch on that. It's more of a at least lighthearted in a way. Although architectural historians, I think architectural historians probably like this, but in my opinion, so it is promoting civic architecture. So whatever people want to assume is the purpose behind this, I do think that that's the whole idea behind preservation, especially preservation of the environment.
It's so funny. It's like all these other ones are like, ooh, kind of gloom and doom, and this last one's like very like pro Section 106. It's pro National Historic Preservation Act. Absolutely,
it's a photo op because
that's okay. I'll take what I can get.
But it's a photo op for nothing because they're like they should take on like community, regional, and whatever. And actually, the architectural standards, architectural governance, I forget what the document's called, already says that. Like they're literally announcing something.
Enough of the stuff we've been talking about, like it already says it.
But
it's one of those things where it's like they're like, we should make prettier buildings, and they're like, yeah. And we should rewrite the regulations. And you're like, the regulations already say make prettier buildings. It just doesn't happen.
Well, and sometimes you need to have a reminder. Sometimes for whatever, and we don't know, how this is going to be moving forward. Maybe this is just a precursor to some more policy that's going to come down. Right. So we don't know, but this is it's a teaser. It's a,
I appreciate the sentiment and like trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, but literally like when you have to tender as a architectural firm for federal buildings, you have to literally go through that document and be like, and this is how we meet this. So like they already know that they need to say like in New Mexico, all federal buildings basically have to have stucco. They have to look like
why is it not happening?
Revival.
So Doug, then why is it not happening? I know you've been in Scotland for a while. Why is it not happening? Because we got some ugly buildings, government buildings. That ain't happening.
Yeah. Well,
I'll tell you.
It's taking advantage of the regional style, which might
No. That's not regional style. These are brick.
That is not true.
Completely inconsistent with the surrounding environment.
Terrible.
It's not happening. Yeah.
I find that our guest, let's be kind to our guest. Spencer wants to say some stuff. Hey, Spencer, what's up?
Oh no, I just thought this one was funny. I mean, in the context of all these super serious things, cutting budgets and employees and regulations, there's just this weird one about like making pretty buildings. Yeah. And like out of all of them, I kind of feel like a lot of these executive orders were just like handed to Trump from like the Heritage Foundation or something. Yeah. I kind of feel like he came up with this. Like this is the one that he came up with. And he's
I can't agree with you more. It totally feels like this building is going to be so beautiful. It's going to be the most beautiful building. It's full of golden columns, you know, like.
And I do know, I didn't know this beforehand, but Mar-a-Lago is a National Historic Site.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until I researched this. And I don't know, it's just really funny. He likes beautiful stuff, obviously. And this is a little glimpse into the soul of Donald Trump, I think.
I think so too. And dude, I do want to end up before we finish. I know we're just about way out of time. I will say that Spencer, I teach a CRM class, and I'm always looking for someone who can bust down all this like really difficult law-based stuff. And your blog has been so helpful for me.
Oh, thanks, Andrew.
Honestly, I was shocked that you had only 250, subscribers or whatever. I'm like, dude, what I want to say as somebody who does like media stuff as well, and it's like I have my YouTube channel and all this kind of jazz. I know that there's gonna be times where you feel like you're just like shouting into a cave. You're gonna be like, I wrote this thing. I don't know. Like, does anybody even care? Does it suck? Is it good? I'm telling you, dude, just keep doing what you're doing because it really helps. So I was so happy when I found your Substack.
I appreciate that, Andrew. It's nice that time's going to good use for sure.
It absolutely is.
It definitely is. I think this is a reminder, but we have a wide breadth of opinions on this podcast, and that's what makes it great, right? And we respect each other for those opinions. And that's how you learn, is to really be open to listening to other people with different perspectives. But when it comes to your career right now, please do not make any rash decisions thinking your career is over, the house is burning down, right? There really, I highly suggest that people really do and start with Spencer's articles and really do some more research on what is the possibility. And you know what? You could be from Doug's perspective and assume that everything is done for nefarious purposes. Not everything. I'm not saying that you're saying everything, but
I'm not assuming that's what they do them for. Okay, I literally just said that's their actions.
I was giving you the benefit of the doubt that you're not saying it's all nefarious, but
no, it's not all nefarious. I mean, pretty buildings. I agree with Spence, man. Like that really does seem like the most random, like. They're not pretty enough. We need to make them the prettiest buildings ever.
The most pretty.
I enjoyed that laugh. I did not criticize. I mean, like I criticized in that they're already supposed to be pretty, but obviously not the prettiest in the world of the very best, however we want to say it. But like,
I'm going to say
off of actions, man. It's actions. Like, I think I'm not saying perspective. I'm literally saying that's what they do. And but it cuts both ways. Like, some of the stuff I would also say is not that big of a deal, and we shouldn't get worked up about it because it's not nefarious. So, so it's actions.
My point is, and we'll leave this podcast with this point, is that, do your research. Don't make decisions based on assumptions. Really try to focus on what really is going to impact you. There may be some of these executive orders that are going to be impactful in a negative way. Let's say that is the case, but is that going to affect you? Is that going to affect everyone in this country? Is that going to affect you? So really focus. If you want to research things aside just for your own interest, that's one thing. But if you're really making decisions on your career and your decisions and what you're going to do with your life, really make sure it's an educated decision. Do the research and determine really what is going to impact you from a practical perspective. And with that, we'll leave you. We are going to be following up with other episodes on and probably digging a little bit deeper into the Chevron case. We're going to dig a little deeper into the wind farm and also into this last executive order that Spencer touched on, and that is Indigenous knowledge and historic preservation, dealing with those two things. So we'll have some more podcasts coming, so keep an eye out for them. Thank you for joining us. And with that, we'll bid adieu.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
See you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye, Spencer. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for the invite.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.